Hello, everyone. This is Tripp, and we're gonna process this election. And I thought the first time talking about it, it would be good to have a philosopher and an ethicist, and not just any of them, ones I'm friends with, so that the processing of this experience that took place in text messages and such can be had. And doing it the first time, we were even talking about this before, given just how much our constituency is unresponsive to all sorts of things, I thought it would be a form of pedagogy for three straight white guys to process it. And then Monday, by the way, Diana Beller-Bass and I will do it, which if you are a homebrew member and join the Ruining Dinner stuff regularly, is fun because I basically am playing shotgun to a historian and scholar of American religion who's much more informed and aware of what's going on. So that happened then, and there's going to be other opportunities for this. But as a philosophical theologian with a philosopher friend and a good old Nibirian ethicist right here, I thought we would attempt at the beginning processing what's going on, of letting each of them kind of frame it from their disciplines. Because the temptation, I think, is all of the energy and emotion and stuff flying out of you. And one of the things theoretically, I hope we've learned in the academy, is not just that we've managed to create a culture of self-righteousness and alienate large portions of the working class, despite having deep commitments to their well-being, is the ability to provide framing reflections with the wisdom that we study and inherit it. And it's our task to figure out how to hand it on. And obviously, that's something I think it's very clear we're doing worse and worse on a regular basis. And being friends with Aaron and Kevin and knowing both of them kind of share this desire in the way we see our work within the academy is also part of a vocation as Christians and as citizens. That's what we're hoping to do. I think we will get a better grade than the Electoral College gets. So that's my optimism. For those who don't,
you setting the bar that low.
Yeah, well, that's so, you lowered.
I mean, it's called a college, but it's not really. Yeah,
I don't know. I should tell you, Tripp. I have actually on a wall in a different room a Uber Doctor from the University of Prestige, which was mailed to me by Kevin Carnahan, because he and I once had a conversation about the fact that universities were just too banal. We needed the University of Prestige. So I actually have that doctorate, the Uber Doctorate, excuse me.
Uber Doctorate.
I don't want to.
With the umlaut over the U. That's important.
Yes, me and Motley Crue are set. That's right.
Well, maybe if we do this well, I can get one before I turn 50.
Yeah.
Now that I know that there's a new metric of success.
Turns out.
Because look, I got all these pictures over here, like Jesus, the gift of the Spirit at Pentecost, the cross, clearly on top of that.
Step it up.
I need
your game is low, my friend.
Yeah.
Right.
That's what
I believe your Uber Doctorate is in awesomeness. I think that's right.
It is. And it's signed, in fact, by Winston Churchill, Barack Obama, Gandhi, I think. It's pretty fantastic. I'll send you a picture, Tripp, if you want to stick it up somewhere so folks can see it.
Yeah. Man, I didn't know these were an option. It's not often you get multiple Nobel Peace Prize winners to sign your Uber Doctorate.
Well, when you know Kevin Carnahan,
that's right.
All things are possible. That's right.
Well, okay, Aaron, how about you introduce Kevin? Then we'll let Kevin, tell us what an ethicist of the Christian tradition is doing these days.
Sounds good.
Because in all likelihood, I can guess what Aaron's going to say, and it might just be too triggering, and then I'll start ranting. So we have the level-headed one here.
Sounds good.
The dispenser of Uber Doctorates.
I am always fine to be the headliner to Kevin's opening act. So this is so I should say to anybody watching, the three of us have a hard time getting together without falling into humor as a mode of engagement. And I don't want anybody to think that that is taking light what it will be a very serious conversation. But I am reminded of the line, first as tragedy, then as farce. And so I actually do think there is some deep healing that can come from getting together with people and reminding each other that humor remains in place when tragedy is all too present. So I say that as my caveat to why I will laugh a lot today, I have no doubt. So I am honored to introduce my distinguished former colleague, Kevin Carnahan, who probably is best well known for beginning his career as a research professor at the University of Virginia. And then he followed that up by becoming a semi-pro volleyball champion in Conway, Arkansas. He's published some other stuff since then, but those are really the highlights.
What difference does it make? So I'm Kevin Carnahan. I've also been like the editor of the Journal of the Society of Christian Ethics, in addition to the made up stuff that Aaron's saying about me. So I guess what does an ethicist have to say about all this? I don't know. The first thing is nothing from a God's eye perspective, right? As we do everything in this, we're approaching as fallible human beings. Let's do none of that kind of evangelical. I've got the definitive take on this and what God wants us to do. I am a Christian realist, a Niebuhrian, which means that I tend to view the world through the revelation of the meaning of the world being love, and the way that love is frustrated in the world. And that means sin. I take sin really seriously. And I find that really helpful at times like this, because I think sin is a helpful category for making sense of what we're going through, why we're going through it. Finitude is another one, just the ways that we are finite and limited and dumb idiots sometimes, and how that limits us and frustrates what God can do with us. And so not giving up hope, but realizing the limitations and frustrations of the possibilities of love in the world, which we're obviously facing at this particular moment. And I'll hand it back to Aaron, my distinguished former colleague, who he hasn't really done anything, to be honest. I can't think of a darn thing. But anyway, he's in the corner, so I'll let him talk.
There you go. Well, and I should say to everybody, Kevin and I go back a long time, and his first book, they made a typo on the back. And so they didn't have visiting assistant professor at Hendrix College. It came out as research professor at University of Virginia.
At the University of Virginia,
which was so his whole career has been like, eventually you can get the title that your first book claimed. Right?
That my first book claimed. That's right. That's
so just the inside joke there. My name is Aaron. I am a philosopher of religion, former president of the Soren Kierkegaard Society, and run a Substack called Philosophy in the Wild, YouTube channel called Philosophy Where We Find Ourselves. And the reason that I think approaching this reality, this President-elect Trump for the second time, as a philosopher, I agree with everything Kevin just said as a Christian, right? That's what Kevin just said is my Christian take on this. My philosophical way of approaching this is from within a subspecialty of mine is political philosophy, and trying to think about, so what is it we mean when we say we're going to protect democracy or care about democracy? And so democracy, as I understand it, influenced by people like Rob Talese and Scott Aiken and others, is democracy is this crazy, complicated ideal of a society that is run by self-governing individuals who see each other as moral and epistemic equals. And that idea of moral and epistemic equality is unbelievably frustrating right now, because my temptation is to see 52% of my neighbors as either immoral or irrational. And in doing that, I'm actually failing to live up to the very ideal of democracy that I think Trump threatens. And so for me, that's where I find myself really wrestling with how then to make sense of this, and then falling back on commitments to hope and finitude always being frustrating, and the reality that at the end of the day, all we can do is the best we can do with what we've been handed. And so being, like Tripp talked about earlier, catastrophizing in the face of catastrophe doesn't actually usually make things better, but finding ways to say this is catastrophe, but how is it then that we can lean into the ideals of moral equality, of epistemic equality, of hope going deeper than tragedy. James Cone talks about that, hope beyond tragedy. That's the sort of space where I find myself and trying to draw on the resources of philosophical tradition to get through it.
Mm-hmm. So, the one of the things that, just for me, at least theologically, there we need to resist the desire to answer the question why immediately, and oftentimes and then not to turn all the energy that we're feeling and the fear and stuff into justifications for continuing practices that generated this reality, right? And so to me, it's more important as a theologian to take seriously something Kevin said at the front, or what you're saying as a philosopher thinking about democracy, is doing a reflection and then thinking about what does a responsible response look like. And that means the kind of critical self-assessment is more about ourselves and the way we show up in the world, the way we enact our participation in the body of Christ, the way we exist as citizens. And I think when I think as a theologian that there are four, I think there are four things we need to refuse to do that are very tempting. And one is refusing cynicism. That because those of us that I think look at the gift democracy has given us as a species, when you take a big picture, human beings without mediating institutions of trust don't know what to do when we get over 120 people. Mm-hmm. And in the past, our solution has been ideological singularity, top-down coercive power, and forcing the anxieties of a culture on a scapegoat, and then underlining it in God, regime, or whatever we want, right? And that is so easy to do at a time where you think a significant number of citizens are your enemy, right? So, like, refusing cynicism, I also think we need to refuse inaction. It is easy to throw your hands up in the air and just go, well, this is your bed, sit in it, right? And then third, I think is, and this is something hinted at by Kevin, is refusing hopelessness. I think part of the gift of any religious tradition, and especially one that tells its story of hope by telling the story of someone executed by collaborating powers of culture, politics, and religion, is one that's the very site of resurrection. Then hopelessness in this moment is one where we let the reality of the present drown out the ongoing, ever-present invitation for divine cooperation and collaboration that's there. And I think the hardest refusal, and one that is why when we started texting about doing this, I'm like, nah, let's do it Friday morning, is refusing contempt about our neighbors. There's an important distinction for within each religious tradition, especially the monotheist ones that recognize the frailty of human finitude, the brokenness of community bonds, be it between ourselves and the divine, our neighbor, our enemy, the land. That when we get anxious and when we don't feel like we have agency to do anything about it, we cultivate contempt, and then we've rendered unto our neighbor who doesn't agree with us a judgment that God renders on no one. So, like Paul says, while we were yet sinners, Christ died for us. Or if you want to love God, you're going to learn to love your neighbor and your enemy. And underneath that is the recognition, I think, at the heart of the Christian tradition, that each person is a site of the divine initiative expressed in love.
Yeah.
And when that's the case, realizing that there's a difference between a judgment of our current situation and those that are collaborating or cooperating with things that from our perspective we find problematic and vile, those kind of things, and rendering that judgment about the individual. And I think the same thing is tempting more on the left of rendering it about the entire historical legacy you're bringing in, be it the democratic experiment and all that kind of stuff. And so refusing contempt, hopelessness, inaction, and cynicism are temptations that are right in front of me and bubble up out of me. And so I just want to name them because I know I'm having them.
Yeah.
And I think those are things that there's a kind of wisdom from traditions like philosophy or religion that have that are birthed with the birth of humanity and have shifted and grown over time. So, like, what is it like to take that wisdom seriously? Or as when Gandalf is talking to Frodo and he's like, "Well, why am I don't even want to be born at this time. Like, why are you handing me this ring? Like, what the hell? Come on, like, it wouldn't have been better if Bilbo just killed him?" And Gandalf just looks at him and where he's like, "Look, you don't pick where you're born, son. Come on, you don't. And if you think that pity even for Gollum, that the right solution is just to have murdered him earlier, then you don't think there's a world where Eru Ilúvatar, the god of Lord, the one true God. There's pre-monotheistic traditions in this mythology, but he's like, pity may actually rule the day, like that there's a different vision of power that we can trust and work with, and you never get to be responsible if you're just wishing you were somewhere else or at another point in time. Responsibility is not wishing you were elsewhere, but figuring out how to be where you are. And so I was rereading that section last night. So anyway, that's where I am. So it's the first question, and this came in from people on my Substack in multiple different ways, was kind of how what are the cultural anxieties that y'all see being expressed in this, right? Because oftentimes the temptation in something like this is to look at just this one thing, this election, and then moralize it and go, oh, let me make my judgment on it, when this doesn't come out of a vacuum. It actually comes out of the web of relations of this nation. And if you just are like substantializing the problem and then reflecting on that, you miss that the kind of web of our relations contain anxieties that generate this response. And so I'm interested how, as an ethicist, Kevin, and then you, Aaron, think about the big picture. Like, what's the energy that we should reflect on other than just the event itself?
Yeah. So I think that what you're seeing right now is, of course, a lot of hand wringing, even recriminations amongst kind of liberals and Democrats about what went wrong, what happened, and I think you're going to see a number of kind of accounts of what it was that just happened. Why did we end up here? You get one of them it was racism and sexism. And there's no doubt that is in the background of everything that happens. inside the United States is a background of this. We know that our voting has inevitably been such that racial demographics determine your vote more than any other consideration. We know that there are people who couldn't bring themselves to vote for a woman, right? And so those concerns are very real and are an ever-present background to everything that we do. And there are some people who are just out and out racist, and there's very little you can do to reach that group or do anything to that. What I would want to say about that, though, is that I don't think that most of the people who are voting for Trump think of themselves at all in those terms or process what they're doing in those terms. Now, they might be, they are, in some sense, participating in systems that are racist and sexist beyond their own particular beliefs. They might be willing to vote for a candidate that stands for kinds of racism and sexism that we should find repugnant, right? But I think that a lot of the people that are even that are voting for those kinds of things are processing it as a kind of protest against a status quo that they see, and it might not be that they approve of those particular things as solutions so much as they want to see somebody do something, right? Maybe even something crazy because they are very frustrated with their politics right now. So racism and sexism, that's definitely playing a role. The second, which you will hear, is that this was really about the working class, and especially the non-college educated working class, who's frustrated and rightly so, because they've been left behind in an economy where manufacturing jobs have fallen off, where and this is just going to be a continuous problem. We started with the decline of labor unions in the 80s, the development of technology that's taken away people's jobs, and AI is only going to expand this. And in the time since the 1980s, no one has made a serious effort to address the problem of figuring out what to do with non-educated laboring class people who are losing their jobs to globalization and these kinds of things. And that those are exactly the people then that look at this and say, I want somebody to do something, right? And the Democrats, for the most part, have represented themselves as, we're the party of sanity, right? We're not going to do anything crazy. And part of that group is just like, no, I want somebody to do something that will shake everything up, because we need a fundamental change in the way that our society is going. And I mean, I think this is one of the reasons that Trump is able to cut in many ways across racial groups that surprise people, right? That you get a bunch of people that his policies objectively will harm, right? But who are like, you know what? I'm going to go with a vote for this guy, or I'm just not going to vote because I don't see anybody else putting it out there to do something, right? So that's another thing. I also don't think that we should lose track of the fact that we are going to blow out of proportion how significant the particular vote was in this case. And there's a couple things to keep in mind here. One is that every single election this year in any Democratic state that has had an incumbent party the incumbent party has gotten wiped away. This is part of a global trend that has to do with inflation, that has to do with people suffering economically, and people wanting a way out of it. prices going up across the globe, and you see in the UK, and it's not ideological, right? The UK had a conservative government. They lost 20% of the vote from 2019 that they had won. Japan had an incumbent government that got thrown out. In India, a right-wing dictator basically like loses votes, loses a mass number of votes. This is happening all over the place. And in part, this is just a global response to a kind of oppressive economy that we have entered into. And in some ways, the Democrats couldn't have done anything about that. Or you could even say, you know what? The amount that Trump won by was actually relatively small in comparison to what happened in other countries. You know, I mean, at the end of the day, uh, Trump is not going to win by very many percentage in the popular vote. And you have to keep in mind that our popular vote is not really a popular vote because there's lots of people in states who just have no real motivation to vote at all. So what might have happened? One interpretation is to say, actually, the Republicans did a horrible job. If Nikki Haley had been nominated, she might have blown out the Democrats by 20 or 30% if the Republicans had put forward a nominee that wasn't one of the most hated people in their own country, right? So those three things I think we want to keep in mind. Racism, sexism, always a background. A concern, especially about non-college educated laboring class that now is cutting across traditional demographic lines. And third, just a global economy that has faced a massive shock after COVID. There was just a shot of inflation that has hurt everybody. And there are, especially on the lower end of the economic scale, and people were just freaked out, and they voted in accord with that. So all of those are anxieties that I think we're seeing worked out in the election.
Yeah. I think it's super helpful. Maybe what I'll do is, because I agree with everything Kevin said, and he said it with a lot of nuance, which is something that obviously is lacking, I think, right now in our political commentary. Let me add maybe a philosophical overlay on those three things. And so maybe a way of making sense of what those three things might say about us as the kinds of social beings we are. The first is, it is tempting always to be reductive when it comes to explanatory accounts, because we like simplicity, because it gives us both something to blame, and also it allows us to then position ourselves as not that thing. This is what, again, I mentioned them earlier, the political philosophers Rob Talese and Scott Aiken talk about as just is cynicism. It's where, you know, to Tripp, you're saying we have to resist cynicism. We have to resist the cynicism of saying, oh, this just is racism. This just is sexism. This just is whatever we want to claim that it just is. As Kevin said, it's that, but it's almost always more than that. And when we say it's more than that, that's where it becomes really difficult, because work becomes hard, right? It's easy to say racists are evil and repugnant human beings. Everyone who votes for Trump are racist, therefore, blah, blah, blah. But then notice that leads us to that situation where now we do not see half of the country as our moral equals. And democracy then has no shot. So we've got to resist the just is cynicism of reductive explanations. I think, Kevin, you did a nice job of explaining, you know, where those temptations lie. When it comes to this idea of the working class living, you know, what poets have long described as lives of quiet desperation, this is deeply, deeply connected to what it means to be finite, right? We've only got what, on, you know, in a good circumstance, with systemic abilities and opportunities and privilege, 80 some years. And given the way we've constructed this contingent thing we call our social lives, we've basically said, what, 2/3 of that time will be spent doing something that is unlikely to give you enough financial security to actually enjoy the other 1/3 of your life. So that fact of, this working class anxiety that Kevin's describing, this is something, if we go back, 100, 200 years, we start seeing early populist movements anchored in working class revolts against what they took to be the elite that were basically robbing them of their finitude, right? Robbing them of their existential right to not just work. There's got to be something more. There's got to be joy in existence. And so that early populism, the story of populism is always when you come together to resist the corrupt, they, typically it was the elites, the ruling class. This then requires someone to speak on your behalf, because otherwise it's just chaos. It's just cacophony. So this is, of course, where unions started emerging, and you had, these suffrage houses. You had these populist movements that were actually in the name of the very thing that the left claims that, it represents and cares about. The problem, of course, is what we might call this left populism, in order to be effective, almost always falls into a quasi-authoritarian model of leadership in order for these voiceless people to have a voice. And that flip is what John Sanders, better than anybody else I've read in his book, Embracing Prodigals, describes as the distinction between authoritative and nurturant value sets. So what we see right now in this, large outcry globally, as Kevin described, against their finitude being robbed from them as a result of power structures that eliminate their humanity, right? This is a class issue that, again, the left should be very, very responsive to. That actually cultivates then authoritative value sets. We need a strong man to step in and fight for us. And that then has, like, the pressure cooker has nowhere to go except through a pressure release valve that is offered right now by a kind of far right model. And that outcome is where I think then you use the word boredom, Kevin. I think this is exactly the right word. Kierkegaard talks about this in his discussions of crop rotation as a kind of existential metaphor. Hey, you know what? I'm just going to keep changing the crops. At least it's different, right? The Rousseau line. I may not be better. At least it's different. So we have now an authoritative upsurge toward right-wing strongman, which we're seeing globally, anchored in real existential anxiety and boredom that is being created by the way we've shaped the lives of far too many. And then the response to say, hey, even if this is crazy, it's not wheat again. Throw some corn in the field, see what happens. And that's where you start getting almost a kind of accelerationist intuition among people who will never actually use that term or understand that theory. This is accelerationist principles in practice as authoritarian value sets. So hopefully that gives a little bit of a kind of a context framing for what Kevin's describing in practical ways. This is deeply, deeply human. This is what existentialists have been talking about for centuries. And unless we can find ways to make solidarity with that fact, it becomes so easy that then contempt results from, the cynicism about those people just being. And that's where I think we would make real mistakes.
Mm-hmm. So there's something in what y'all are saying that I had been thinking about, and yesterday when Diana and I were talking, she was like, it is extremely depressing that basically what happened was what you anticipated. And I thought was, she's like, I told a bunch of my friends, it was like, Tripp basically told me he thought this was going to happen and was trying to get me to talk him out of it. Right. And when it goes to that element of the experience of the working class, there's two parts of it that I think are worth naming, because if you generate, oh, let me have contempt for these people, then you don't recognize the places we might all be under the same pressures materially and culturally that are raising the anxiety. It's just what you do with it may look different. And I think part of it is, there's like a giant epidemic of burnout that has been increasing ever since, like Kevin said, since the 80s, when we made this shift towards a neoliberal economic situation. Then, and this is across the West, but we do it best in America of saying, like, let us continue to narrow the amount of our shared reality that is collaborative. Let us turn, say, workers who could have solidarity into entrepreneurs. Let us turn places of collective communal responsibility into individual tasks that you're now morally responsible for anything that comes out of it. And at one point, right, that makes sense at a time where there's this ongoing expanse of the pie, in a sense, because then you go, okay, well, there's this kind of meritocracy that generates this kind of thing. But what's happened since the 80s is the growth of the pie, and who gets it and who actually has a horizon to hand off to their kids something better than what they have, has continued to shrink. And after '08, it extended to the managerial class, those that have degrees. It intensified for the working class, all the while, right? Communities of solidarity, both religion, political parties that are connected to the working class, the unions, all these kinds of elements start degrading. And then the managerial class, if you want to succeed and outcompete, because there are less spots, right, even in your own class rank for the next generation, to do that game, you take up more student loan debt, you move multiple times, so now you're alienated from your communities at home. You end up, say, in blue cities. And okay, so like there are all these pressures, and then the number of people burning out is going up. And I think one of the temptations, if we think of early, if we go back 40 years, that was expressed as greed. It's greed. Look at these people trying to get for themselves. But now I don't think it's greed. I think it's fear, that people realize that just the way we've structured the world, there will be more people left out in the next generation than are this time. And so now individuals and families are fearful that even if they have integrity, work hard, and do the right thing, their kids are not promised even the place they are, let alone a bigger horizon. And so that shift of burnout extending to an increasing number of the population at the same time, where your agency can have connections, is increasingly narrowed. The managerial class joins the burnout society. You're at a frenetic standstill where you have to get more, do more, become more efficient in all these things just to stand still. And then that generational regression, where the chance your kid even arrives where you are is smaller and smaller. I mean, when you said, Aaron, that this is robbing the working class of their finitude, I think what we're seeing when you see so many people that don't even fit in that, right, responding to a kind of return to a to Trump and the economic system and such that it brings up, is that the finitude of the managerial class is extending, it is being robbed as well. So then, what do you do when you're burning out? And I think that the anxiety of burnout connects to two other big fears. One is the uh, increasing number of people know we're burning up a planet, and yet the drive of acceleration you were naming there, Aaron, requires us to keep burning it up, because we can't imagine a world where we organize and structure things differently.
Yep.
And then we're sitting there going, and the only way we know how to think of it is at the nation state level. But the crises we're facing are ones even our politicians don't know what to do with, say AI, or labs making, checking stuff, and then a biological thing gets out, or nukes, and there are all these elements where we look at our world and we're outstripped of agency, even in our collectives. So we go burn it down, burn it down. One is, let's put this guy back in charge. Another, think of how many people on the left think the concept of the common good is really a Trojan horse for ideology, or that we can't connect to our past history because of these evils, and so we have to burn it down, as if we're going to do better without any structures of mediation. And so I think that whole like burnout to burning down structures and systems to burning up a planet leaves people so exhausted, stripped of agency. And when that's what you're doing, and you get a moralizing auntie telling you about here's what we really need to do, and let's pay attention to these little things, and you're just looking going like, what world are you in? I don't even know what it is, but we don't lose sleep for the same reasons. And so no, right? And to me, that like recognizing that and just doing a little bit, just starting to discern the material pressures that are generating it, can actually help us avoid having contempt for the other, and hopefully go like, how do we actually build solidarity to go, we're all caught up in a giant whirlpool of escalation where we burn up, burn down, burn out. And like, what does it mean to build community and collaborate in ways where we don't destroy each other in the process? But if we don't recognize the anxieties that are generating it in the way our patterns of relation do, I think we're screwed.
Mm-hmm. Let me just, so I want to complicate things by another level, and this is something that's come up.
Complicate things.
Yeah, I want to. Yeah, that's exactly what I want. This has actually come up in the chat. There's one guy who's said, "What about the anxiety of me? I'm a black guy," or "What about the anxiety of me? I'm LGBT." Right? And I do think so. So we've talked about a narrative where since the 1980s there has been this economic development of inequality, growing inequality, and problems for the labor force. We should overlap that with another narrative where since the 1940s, there have been incredible advances in the liberties of people inside of our country, the ability of people to be themselves, right. And this is one thing that I think that we're always in danger of, is like picking up one of these narratives and losing the other. And there's a danger there that then we become nostalgic for a time when things were actually worse for LGBT and Black and these people, right? And part of the answer to that is saying this is not a zero-sum game, right? It's not that we have to trade off these things for each other, but we need to reconceive of a world where we can be concerned both about economic inequality, the burnout problem that the non-college educated labor class is going through, and concerned about the status of LGBT people and Black people and those things going on. And part of what I want to say is this election was not a zero-sum game thing. Now, the effect of the election is a zero-sum game thing. The policies of the Trump administration view the world as a zero-sum game. But I do not accept that the American electorate actually was advocating for a zero-sum game thing. I think that the American electorate, like those people that shifted for particular reasons, that one concern overcame another concern. And just to get at that, exit polling showed that 54% of voters believe that Donald Trump's views are too extreme, right? But he won 12% of the people that said his views are too extreme. Now, that tells you, right, they don't agree with all of the racism. They don't agree with all of that stuff. But for reasons of their economic anxieties, for reasons of, I mean, at times, for reasons of their concerns about Democrats not standing against the war in Gaza, right? They said, we're going to go with this guy because he's not the status quo, right? And I think that needs to be appreciated, that the vote is more complicated than simply, this was not a vote for fascism. Now, the outcome is fascism, I mean, that's the policies that will get put in place if we go to mass deportation, if we go to this stuff. Like, those are really horrible outcomes. But in part, I want to think that my neighbors are better. That might require me believing that they don't understand what they did entirely, right? That they were motivated by some real concerns that led them to make some bad decisions about this, right? And some decisions that will be harmful to people. And I don't want to like deny the anger and the frustration and the concern. I mean, I'm the father of a trans kid, and I can tell you that I am freaked out right now about what life is going to look like for my child once Trump has put into place the Supreme Court justices. And, we're looking at 30 years from now before we have a rational Supreme Court again. These are going to have horrible repercussions, and I don't want to deny that. I also want to say that I don't think that this was a vote for that, as much as those people who shifted are frustrated and they want something, right? And they went out and they did this. And I think that the proper response is to say we can have a world where you have all of these things, right? Where you have the economic concerns, where we recognize something went wrong economically in the 1980s, but that doesn't mean we haven't been making advances in other areas since the 1980s. And we don't want to go back, right? We want to go into a new future where everybody's included. And so I think that's important to keep that whole thing in mind.
Yeah, that's helpful. I think something that helps me make sense of, Kevin, is the they to which we refer as, the Trump voter is similarly not reducible to just one thing, right? And so though we are, I think, doing a good job of saying in particular, right, this broad working class coalition that cut across racial groups in ways that, to be honest, I was unexpecting. That was, I was surprised by some of the jump in the male Latino vote and stuff. That seemed higher than I thought it would bounce. The degree to which white women didn't shift as far toward Harris as I was expecting. So it was interesting to see there is this. If there's a coalition, I think it's a coalition around the kind of issues we're discussing. That said, I think it's also important to understand the vocal people with whom I find myself engaging on a semi-regular basis that are advocates for Trump. I actually think that the vocal supporters might look slightly different than this broad coalition that I think is where we should spend our energies trying to understand. And the reason I say that is because the more vocal people, right, the genuinely I'm with Trump, not just I'm not with this, right? Yeah. And Trump represents different, let's go, right? I think and there was a comment that came in and said this, it's important to understand that the way in which predominantly white evangelical Christianity understands itself is deeply, exclusively committed to this authoritative value set that John Sanders describes. And so as a result, even those within that space who might be college educated, who might be, at least the managerial, if not, upper classes, the idea that the left represents moral decay, the erasure of value, the communist takeover of our Christian nation. I think that's also another overlay just to keep in mind, because when we think, well, who is it that's kind of, out there loud about what's going on? To be honest, and it may just be that I run in the wrong circles, I don't know, but it's rarely these kind of economic accounts that show up in frustration, right? It's more this, we vote our biblical values against these people who are demonic. Mm-hmm. And so I think another way to think about one of the unbelievably seductive modes by which right-wing populism slides into authoritarianism, one of the modes by which this has historically occurred is by giving it a theological overlay, such that then you're not just, I mean, I'll be back up. You're not even able to make sense of those material realities of your existential frustration because you've been handed by your pastor or your friend on Facebook or whoever. No. What's really going on is that they are robbing your way of life, and then to stand with God is standing against them, right? So I think it's important to recognize the way in which we're trying to be, I think, very nuanced about what this coalition is, how it functions, why it requires us to look at material realities of lonely, fragile human bodies. And that's where we overcome contempt, I think, right? That's where hope emerges for me. Because I too know what that feels like, even if I don't know what it feels like for a trans person, because I'm not that identity. I know what it feels like to be alone. I know what it feels like to be frustrated, but I don't know what it feels like to be the victim of racism, right? So we can start finding these human connections that then allow us to have empathy for the ways in which different systems play out in horrifying ways for so many of our friends and neighbors. But that overriding contempt strategy must also take seriously what is the narrative that is, at least for I'd say, significant subset, not all, but a significant subset of that group, they've not been allowed to narrate it that way, right? They have to narrate it as good versus evil in a very, very narrow sense that requires them not to be able to move beyond abortion, even if it turns out either one of them gets elected. There was zero that's going to happen relative to policy regarding abortion. Like you say, that ship sailed, right? And it sucks. Like, here we are. But voting for Kamala wasn't going to do anything about that. We've got 30 years before anything would happen. It's certainly not going to be a constitutional change. So the fact that they would think this is still my issue means that they don't understand what it is that voting does relative to policy, but they're certainly scared of what they've been told those people represent. So I don't want to forget that narratival overlay, because I think it, to be honest, lets off the hook too many of the quote unquote faith leaders running around riling up their communities in the name of something that is actively forgetting their humanity by trying to encourage them toward a theory of ensoulment or a view of eschatology that actually has erased what it looks like to show neighbor love in material and oppressive conditions.
Yeah, just another example of how complicated this is. Of voters, 65% said that they preferred abortion to be legal. Right?
That's right.
Only 31% said they preferred for abortion to be illegal. But Trump won 29% of those who said they wanted abortion to be legal. Right? Now, this might blow our minds, right? And I'm actually a little bit less optimistic than Aaron. I don't know that Republicans in the House won't put forward an effort to try and get a national abortion ban, right? I think it would be politically foolish for them to. And so I don't know that it'll go anywhere. But I do think that there's a danger of thinking of this as a victory for the Christian nationalist group. If they read it that way, they're reading it wrong. And I think if we read it that way, we're reading it wrong. And I think, again, the outcomes are in some cases going to be horrible. But what we need to understand is that in some ways the American electorate is just deeply incoherent on these things. I mean, I live in Missouri, where we both passed a statement that would put into the Constitution of our state that there's a right to an abortion, and elected a whole bunch of officials that will immediately try and undermine that as quickly as possible. Right? We're just incoherent on these things oftentimes.
So I have a question for you, Tripp, in light of this, because I guess I agree with you, Kevin. This was not a victory for Christian nationalism as such. Mm-hmm. I do think Christian nationalists claim victory.
Yeah.
Because of the way they've narrated what's going on, and that's become so infectious, right? Mm-hmm. But Tripp, I have a question for you as a philosophical theologian. I've been working with my students this semester. I'm actually teaching a class on God and justice. I'm also doing a lot of work in another class on political philosophy. And we just read this amazing book by a guy named Paul Woodruff that I highly recommend. It's super readable. And it's just called Reverence, Restoring a Forgotten Virtue. And what Woodruff does is he says the single most important thing when it comes to like cultivating a sense of solidarity, a sense of connection, leaning into these, human associations that allow for community action. He says we've got to find a way to go back to reverence, not in a sense of going back to an earlier age, but going back to this as a source for human flourishing. And he talks about, ancient Greek society and ancient Chinese society and different sort of ancient wisdom traditions that we can draw upon. But here's the key about reverence that I find fascinating. Reverence, he says, at its most basic, is the view that all humans are humans. which is such a trivial claim, right, Kevin? If anything's trivial.
If anything's a human's a human.
A human's a human.
Who's going to disagree with that?
You're going to say Snow's white.
Well, and the reason that he says this is so important and so forgotten is because many of us begin to think, no, I'm better than that, right? I'm a god. And this is where then oligarchy and authoritarian starts emerging as supported by those who say, oh, I want to be like Musk. I want to be like this. And so let's encourage their ascendancy. So the radical equality of the human condition, none of us are God, right? Which is the first point of reverence. And the second point of reverence is that leaders who are reverent are responsible for cultivating the compassion of those who follow them. Those are the two big takeaways from this book. And as a philosophical theologian, Tripp, you have a large community that follows the work you do and that you bring together. I missed Theology Beer Camp a few weeks ago, but what do you see as actual encouragement for people to be leaders fostering compassion? Because I genuinely wrestle with what that looks like even for me. Because I don't know, people may have read, I posted a thing the day after the election, quoting John Lewis and Anne Lamott, says, don't let them get you to hate them. And I went through 4 or 5 things. I thought, hey, here's what I'm trying to say to myself. I hope it helps others as well. And there's one line in there where I'm going through, when you've done all to do to stand, not forgive 7 times, but 70 times 7. This is hard. I'm kind of walking through the weight of these encouragements. I say, do you mean we can't throat punch people? I'm like, nope, blah, blah, blah. That was the only line that was my voice in that entire essay. Because where I stood was, no, I just want to go let the air out of tires of anybody who's got a MAGA hat on, right?
Yeah.
And yet I know that that's not the person I'm okay with being. But that was the person I was in that moment. And so I wrote this thing trying to remind myself of what it looks like to follow my own commitments to compassion. So how do we do that, Tripp? How do we lead people into compassion, given that the whole point is we do it because we are radically equal as humans?
Okay, so there's 2 vignettes I think that might help, but I'll just say it's the notion of reverence and kind of giving the other the dignity to be other is something that is increasingly hard to do because of, I think, the increasing individualism and isolation of society We have people, a lot of people living in multiple realities, and so it's just hard to be in relationship long enough to discover what if your assumptions, framings, and even the facts of the situation are so different from the other person's that what would reverence look like requires like a 2-to-1 listening to speaking ratio, right? And I was thinking of my grandmother saying, "Well, God gave you 2 ears and 1 mouth. Do accordingly." And thinking about that going into this, where I was sadly not surprised and feel disgusted to be vindicated by my anticipations. I think part of it is that the scale of our relationships has been so narrowed, and then so much of it is algorithmically mediated. Our understanding of the other is foreign to the other's self-understanding in ways that it is hard for us to come to recognition with without really commuting through listening to their experience. And that's really hard to do. And so there are 2 conversations that give an example, and they're very similar. So I'll just pretend like it was one, but one happened at Theology Beer Camp with a clergy who's come before, brought 2 friends from their congregation who were not sure who they're voting for, kind of thing. And we were, during the festival, have the Oktoberfest side where, there's food trucks and beer tasting and cigars, and we have a conversation. And then my moving back to the States after being gone and moving back to North Carolina after having not been here for a long time, I feel like that gave me a kind of observation point to notice stuff. And I spend quite a bit of, it's not surprising. Tripp loves smoking cigars and talking, and I like it because it says we've now something in common. We're going to talk for an hour. And so here, having conversations with in Greensboro Cigar Lounge with working class people that are both Hispanic and Black and white, who all voiced to me a very different reality. The same that some of these congregants that came with a church member, and their initial response is on that one trans ad that was ran incessantly. Now, as someone like Kevin with trans family members, like, it is hard to hear that anyone taking that ad seriously is anything other than an attack on the dignity of a family member. Right. And being in a cigar shop with individuals, I'm sitting there like, why are ethnic minorities using this logic, and you're wanting to go into a history lesson, you're wanting to and you're like, well, this is not, so I'm just asking questions. And it gets down to like, why are we going to go spend all this money on a surgery for a prisoner? And I was like, do you know how many there is? There were 2. Do you know who was president and when that was happening? Donald Trump. And it was the law, and she was obeying the law. Yeah. And I said, but you know what else happened in that time that I imagine we agree on is that while either any of these presidents we were talking about, Obama on, I said, in that time, we as a country spent money executing 68 people who were who additional evidence and testimony, even of prosecutors, advocated for their innocence. And so, so for me, thinking about like the law and funding and the prison industrial complex and stuff, that we executed a whole bunch of people and only one of them was white, makes me think that I should be a bit suspicious on this kind of conversation, and she was like, well, we were going back and forth, and it made it enabled to make sense. And so like that kind of conversation was helpful, along with the the experience of a, say, so like all the things we think through of what is uncomfortable for us about people that may have voted in a different way, I'm always like, and I was uncomfortable doing this. Do you know how morally abhorrent I see our support and weapon sales to not just Israel, quite a few people? Do you know how utterly disappointed Kamala accommodating fossil fuel industry to try to win a vote was? Like, I think as a Christian who has certain values that come out of it, you can understand how someone could think this is the correct decision to do in a voting booth, while going, I find it morally abhorrent. And if I was not in a swing state, I don't think I would have voted for her over those issues. But I was, and I think it's the right thing to do as a harm reduction strategy. But none of them are the coming of the kingdom of God, or the main way we determine the morality of someone. And then from their perspective, listening long enough, I could see that they recognize, right, like the data that Kevin said, and someone in the chat had talked about some of the members of their own mainline congregation saying like, people have all these different logics, and if we don't take time and give that reverence you're talking about, then we are going to put everyone in a silo with our judgment. And I know what that feels like from my friends that are much more progressive than me, who are just like, you genocide enabling blah 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 blah. And my response is like, I don't disagree with you. If I was in a swing state, I'd do this. I even told, I joked, I was like, I literally was just texting Cornel West this. I don't know what you want me to do. Like, but I'm sitting here thinking like, this is what I do here, but I wasn't going to try to get him on the ballot in North Carolina for this very reason, but if I was in California still, and it's like, to me, that like that experience of thinking in my own tribe about how I get pushback, how could you X, Y, and Z, and I share their values, and then listening to people say in this other context and going, oh, I understand how they see the world, and I can see it, and then I can have a conversation and introduce the funding and killing of innocent people that just happen to all be minorities, and then that can complicate it and things, but they without choosing to listen and choosing to be in relationship, then we have a problem. And I think that element that exists that is just increased in our context is we create reality where we never engage otherness. And when we and then we come up with ideological justifications for not doing so. And that goes right back to that contempt thing I said at the beginning. Because if that's what God's initiative was, then the one who loves in freedom would have just hung out with the Trinity, and so anyway, that's what comes to mind. But I don't think it's easy. I don't think it and I would just say it also looks very different if you're me or my trans family member, what those relationships look like.
Absolutely.
Right. So that in anyone who's there's a kind of solidarity of listening to otherness where their reverence is recognized, and then there's a kind of solidarity of using one's own privilege and agency to stand in solidarity with those that are being harmed. And it is just complicated, right? That's one of the reasons when Kevin was on the podcast, I don't know, 6 months or so ago, where I said the older I get, the more reasonable Reinhold Niebuhr is.
Yeah, that's right.
That makes sense. Well, it's funny, the thing I was just real quick, that sense of otherness, right? How do we cultivate that awareness, the encounter with otherness? Woodruff in the book, it's fascinating. One of the things he suggests, and this I think is tapping into also structural realities that we often recognize but don't bring into conversations like this. So somebody put a comment about, we've got to be careful that we don't think like, oh, follow me to success. I've got the model, right? And Kevin, you're right to say we don't stand in a God's eye perspective. We do the best we can where we are. But notice the further we also move as a global society, not just in America, toward the degradation of humanistic education in the name of something like education just for material success. Right? Notice we've now split those two things off from each other. So the ones who are, in our economy, most likely then to have the success that facilitates the kind of freedom that allows the kind of agency that we're describing are actively more and more and more those who did not have to wrestle with Plato or navigate reading books by Maya Angelou or, encounter Beethoven's Fifth Symphony, like Ninth Symphony. What it is that we do is,
what do you have against the Fifth Symphony? Why?
It was the wrong one. I
okay,
like
all right,
Ninth
fine.
better.
All right.
Yeah, but the idea is
it's such an elitist thing we just did. Okay, so anyway.
The turn in the third movement in the ninth.
Yeah, that's right.
The resolution
right.
of the minor.
It's so much more compelling than the motif that repeats only 3 times. That's right. And we are proving our point. But the idea, though, is what Woodruff recommends is that we create ceremonies and rituals of connection that are anchored in, and this is cool to me, appreciating the humanities as a resource, right? And so the things I think that, the 3 of us all do in our public work, our attempts to, bring philosophy, Christian theology, ethical theory to broader audiences and think and sit and wrestle with ideas. But the idea that this is something active. Yes, Linda, you win. That's exactly right.
There's no wrong Beethoven symphonies, Linda's.
The idea, though, that like my own university right now has consultants on campus. They're not advertising how much money we are spending, but I'm sure it's a lot, to figure out how we can be more efficient. As somebody posted earlier, efficiency is one of these code words for dehumanization, right? So we've got efficiency experts at a liberal arts college trying to bring a corporate intelligence to a humanistic community to think about how we can be better at the thing we do, while at the same moment, everyone on campus just had their insurance deductibles quadrupled going into January, right? So it again, you talk about those cognitive dissonances you just can't quite make sense of, Kevin. For me, one other layer of this is we also find ourselves in a situation where we're describing, college educated versus non-college educated. But I think moving forward, what does college educated mean? More and more and more, it does not mean people engaged with these sorts of questions and these sorts of, nuanced accounts of the complexities of existence. It's people who have a skill set to be better than others in the zero-sum game of material acquisition. And that also is where we think, wow, the structural concerns. Yes, we've got to fight structural racism. Yes, we've got to fight transphobic realities in our society. Yes, we've got to fight genocide and policies that support it. There is no qualification to that yes. But we've also got to add to that unqualified yes, let's think about what it even means to educate. How is it that we're inviting people into some sort of sense of what thinking even looks like? No wonder Joe Rogan is popular among this crowd, because Rogan is, and I apologize if this will be taken wrong, he's the foolish man's version of a smart man, right? Because he is presenting himself as thoughtful and reflective and wrestling with ideas. The problem is he's wrestling with ideas without any actual awareness of how to wrestle, because that's not the point. Right? That's a joke, right? Of course, because MMA. But the idea is his only notion of wrestling is that kind of physicality, that aggressiveness. And for what it's worth, I've listened to some of his stuff and thought, hey, that's actually a compelling conversation he is fostering. The problem is distinguishing a compelling conversation from absolute wackadoo insanity. There's no differentiation in the context of the audience that also has been talked down to, right? And not allowed to think, to wrestle, to engage, to reflect. And that's a thing that I think, again, another layer of this difficult situation is when our university administrators are complicit with the very degradation of human esteem as a result of the idolatry of revenue as the only model of human dignity, it becomes increasingly difficult to see how one would even push back, given the skill sets we bring to the table.
Yeah. So let me add another level to that, which is, this is so complicated in a world where we both have people that feel talked down to, who have not been allowed to have that conversation, at the same time as we have a kind of attack on expertise, people who are scientists, people who actually understand how viruses work, people who understand how, right, that we get this attack on people who are experts. And on the one hand, you want to be able to say in today's society, hold on, listen to people who are educated, right? Listen to people who are experts. How do you do that at the same time as opening the conversation to people who have been talked down to, right? How do you foster a conversation that both includes everybody and doesn't at any point kind of tip your hat to crazy people who want into the conversation and want to then take this over? I mean, we're looking at a world where apparently Robert Kennedy is going to be in charge of our health systems in the United States, which is utterly horrifying. If we thought that things were crazy under the first Trump administration, this is going in a very different direction. And figuring out how to balance those things, right? How to allow the conversation, encourage the conversation, bring people into the conversation, and at the same time try and control misinformation, try and control disinformation, try and control, how those things go at it. These are, I mean, in some ways, these are problems of the postmodern world, right? Where in a modern world, you could easily control this stuff. You had professionalization of the media, who gave the microphone to people who were maybe the elite, and nobody thought anything about it. They were just like, oh, okay. And those people did, either, that wasn't always a good system, because oftentimes it was like racist and elitist and whatever else, but it had protections on the guardrails against misinformation, which we just don't have anymore. And figuring out how to do both of these things is incredibly difficult. And I'll just add another layer to this, which is, we're talking about figuring out ways to encourage conversation and build these bridges, but in the next 4 years we're going to have to do that at the same time that we figure out how to put a stick into the wheel of what the policies of the United States are doing. Right? So when it comes to the harmful things that the Trump administration is going to do, how can we both figure out how to resist those, like big R resistance, and build conversations across lines that haven't been good ways of conversing in the past? I mean, because we have to take both of those very seriously. At times, as a Christian, I think so. Tripp, you've been doing a lot of stuff on Bonhoeffer, right? Responsibility in emergency circumstances is something we need to take seriously today, which is, we're about to see, if we go into a period of mass deportation, we're going to see families ripped apart. We're going to see, draconian measures that are going to be taken in the United States, that we need to think about. Is this a time when I take a migrant family into my house and hide them from the government, right? So that they're not allowed to do this. And how do we form a resistance at the same time that we open up conversations to people who have been excluded because they are the labor class that has not been included in those conversations, and they often will hold anti-immigrant positions, so how do you put those two things together? These are the tensions that we have to live in.
It's so interesting, because the very people who would celebrate the kind of or discuss in positive terms, those who hid, Jewish families during National Socialism are now often the ones holding up mass deportation signs. Like the cognitive dissonance that you're describing on our end, how do you both invite, show hospitality, and also put a spoke in that wheel? Also flips, where how do you engage people who are actively holding incoherent views, and showing that incoherence is shown as just your elitism, right? So no, I think that was very well said, Kevin. And I have, unfortunately, where my strategy right now is, I'm teaching a radical political theory class this spring as an attempt to say, hey, you know what? I don't actually have answers, but let's read people who've wrestled with this stuff. And it's scary stuff to read, right? Because it may not just be, how do we think about protests and pacifist marches? Let's read the books of the people that are talking about, like, how you bribe cops, right? Not because I'm recommending it at all, but because I think unless we are also thinking about what it looks like to make sense of where we are as 3 years, 4 years before, maybe 3 months before things having flipped past a line that we couldn't recognize, right? Let's think this through. Let's make this an idea. And then it looks like a lot of text messages to friends saying, hey, what would Bonhoeffer's confessing church look like today? I'm in. Whatever that is. And I don't know, but whatever, because of course that's my strategy, right? Like, I have much less sympathy with, like, the invisible committees. Here's how you bomb railway stations and disrupt traffic flow. I'm way more interested in, how do you create the confessing church as a public witness? And to be honest, I just don't know, because it will look different for us than it did for Bonhoeffer.
I'm more sympathetic to stopping traffic and all, in part because this is one thing that Republicans, conservatives have learned, is that you can screw up the society and people will get upset about it, and they'll vote on being upset, right? In order to kick the people who are in office out at the level of president, right? They'll keep their local representative because they don't associate them with that. But this is one of the things that I think we have to take seriously, is that part of our responsibility is to, I don't want to say this wrongly, but to make society dysfunctional for the next 4 years, right? That part of what our job is to reveal the ways in which the policies that Trump is putting forward are harmful and will not work, and not allow them to work, and point out.
Do you think the way that can happen, though, is allowing people to see a difference between, hey, you can be a conservative and you might even be right, though I disagree, versus supporting Trump as undercutting your own conservative commitments? Like, I think that wedge has been helpful when some people have done it. The problem is, I think the wrong people have been put forth. Like, when it comes to Liz Cheney, her record is so repugnant to me that I have no real respect that she finally found a threshold beyond which she wouldn't go. So it does seem to me, though, that being able to allow an off-ramp, hey, and this is true, this is my agonistic democracy sentiments, we need people who have different social visions when it comes to public policy, when it comes to strategy, because only in that agonistic tension is there real humility about, I might be wrong, right? And so I need that push. This is Tripp, one mouth, 2 ears. I need 2 critics to every one manifesto, right?
Yeah.
But at the same time, giving them a way to see agonism outside antagonism is I think, important.
Yeah, the immediate thing that I think of when I'm discussing this is a protest that I went to during the first Trump administration, where we were doing a march through downtown in the city where I live, and they didn't want to interrupt traffic at any point, So they had the, everybody waits until all the cars are passed and then you go. And I think, did anybody realize that we were protesting, right? Did we actually do anything to disrupt at all? Or were we just a bunch of really nice white people having a walk downtown, right? Where we didn't want to offend anybody. We didn't want to, and I do think that if we don't raise the flag that things are going wrong, right? That people might just think, I don't see it, right? I don't notice it, and I don't want that, right? In some ways, that just strikes me as a very bourgeois protest, right?
But do you
Where
worry about, back to that kind of crop rotation, the idea of just always being the sky is falling? I think the sky's falling, but
yeah,
I also think there's even on college campuses, fully
yeah,
support diversity, equity, inclusion initiatives. And yet I can tell you my students who even support it, it's just sort of noise in the background now because it's just so ubiquitous. And then of course it became problematic and then it's an issue. I wonder if the constant critique, which believe me is where I'm at and where I plan to be for a long time, I do wonder if there's not a exhaustion factor both on us, right? That it's just hard to be frustrated this long, right? And also an exhaustion factor on those hearings, oh, that again, right? And I recognize, again, I want to have a footnote. There is definitely a frustrating awareness that what we're talking about as exhaustion for other, groups who have been marginalized for decades, if not centuries, have modeled what it looks like to live in the midst of an exhaustion that I can't even physically make sense of. And so I think that we may actually, again, find resources for answering my own question by tapping into liberation theologies, womanist theologies, queer theologies, etc. But I do worry about that some, right? Where it's just the, liberals.
I don't want to underestimate the political significance of those movements as much as it might seem like. I mean, in some ways, the protests that happened about Gaza, right, hurt Kamala. I mean, that's one of the things that actually had an effect. If you look at the votes of Muslim Americans in Michigan, right? There's no place that Jill Stein did any better than in those places. One of the reasons that Biden was successful in getting elected was because he came right after the Floyd protests, those things do have an effect. They are disruptive. They are, yes, they can be exhausting, but they also have political effects, and usually in the direction that the protesters intend them to have political effects in. So yeah, I agree. There's always a danger there, but I don't want to underestimate the extent to which public organizing and protest can actually have effects on the world.
Yeah, I agree.
So, we need to wrap things up, but I want to let y'all each. There was a series of questions that came in that all are similar, but Janine's version I'll use, and she said the temptation for those of us that are leaders in faith community, or going to be, to make more space for a new world in the new world we're walking into, to accommodate and not alienate members of our congregation by declaring the truth of the situation clearly. And so, thinking of that, I want y'all to think about what you'd like to say. When I was looking through those questions and saw it, I thought of this passage. This is me vamping while y'all think of what you want to say. And it's this passage. It's in The Return of the King, the third book, Lord of the Rings. This is when Sam and Frodo going to Mordor. It's a chapter, Mount Doom. It's near the beginning. of course, not everyone knows where this is when you just start reading it, but this is when Sam is this deep despair that knows Frodo's been claimed by the ring, and that they won't be able, they don't have the food and everything for the return journey. And it says that this is Sam had just given the last of the Lambus to Frodo. And the Lambus throughout this functioning, like as they only had Lambus, it functions very much like the Eucharist. So like the memories of home and stuff are there anyway. So there could be no return. And then this is like Sam's reflection in his head. So that was the job I felt that I had to do when I started, thought Sam, to help Mr. Frodo to the last step and then die with him. Well, if that is the job, then I must do it. But I would dearly like to see the Bywater again, and Rosie Cotton, and her brothers, and the Gaffer, and Marigold, and all. I can't think somehow that Gandalf would have sent Mr. Frodo on this errand if he hadn't been any hope of his ever coming back at all. Things all went wrong when we went down in Moria, and that's when Gandalf died. I wish he hadn't. He would have done something. But even as hope died in Sam, or it seemed to die, it was turned into a new strength. Sam's plain hobbit face grew stern, almost grim, as the will hardened in him, and he felt through all his limbs a thrill, as if he was turning into some creature of stone and steel that neither despair nor weariness nor endless barren miles could subdue. With a new sense of responsibility, he brought his eyes back to the ground near at hand, studying the next move. As the light grew a little, he saw to his surprise that what from a distance seemed wide and featureless flats were in fact all broken and tumbled. And then he goes on describing landmarks John are going to get. And then for the hungry and worn who had far to go before life failed, it had an evil look. Thinking of all these things, Sam went back to Frodo and had no need to rouse him. Frodo was lying on his back, eyes open, staring at the cloudy sky. Well, Mr. Frodo, said Sam, I've been having a look around and thinking a bit. There's nothing on the roads, and we'd best be getting away while there's a chance. Can you manage it? I can manage it, said Frodo. I must. And when you think of, I mean, even what's going on in the world when he's writing this, and having experienced World War I, his son is in World War II, and things. It's fascinating to me how the relationships that birth them and their home play this one role, and then this responsibility in the present, and the reality they're facing didn't change, but the recognition that he has a friend, and they have a responsibility, and that it's in the recognizing of relationships with responsibility to the world, and to each other, that he has this transformation of steel and rock and finds fortitude. And nothing about their reality changed other than the recognition that he and Frodo are together, and that there must be hope in it. And so it's just that reframing moment and the connection there on friendship that I think, like when I think of the questions and what happens in community, one is like being honest about the reality and not going away from it, but also insisting, like, we wouldn't be here if there was no hope. But how does hope get enacted? It's with a friend, and it's with stories. And this is just a few passages right before he realizes, like, oh, we're in this big story, and such. So to me, reading those questions last night, the people had sent in, especially people thinking about faith communities, the moment where all hope was lost, well, almost lost, is powerful. Yes, and Gary, Lord of the Rings came out of Tolkien's experience of life during World War I, and then he's writing it while in World War II, which essentially the recognition that Europe didn't learn much, and his son was in the war, having little interaction, and they would what came to be Lord of the Rings, was part of the letter exchange. And
Mhm.
there's a whole long conversation about that elsewhere on the podcast.
So I'll say there are bad ways for faith communities to take this, and I think I've seen them. One bad way is just stay away from this stuff. Go in the direction of self-help, and we'll have discussions about how to deal with your finances and how to right. That's been one strategy that people have taken. Um, I think that there's an important role in speaking truth, right? And speaking a full truth. So just for you, Tripp, I'll do this. This is from Rings of Power, though. So it's Celebrimbor. It is not strength that overcomes darkness, but light. Armies may rise, hearts may fail, and light still endures. It is mightier than strength, for in its presence all darkness must flee. And I think this is a deeply Augustinian statement in many ways, that what's real at the end of the day is the light, right? And the light gets inhibited by all sorts of things in our lives. It gets obscured, and in part, what we're doing here is exactly trying to articulate that full truth about the anxieties of the people who voted for Trump, the anxieties of the people who voted against Trump, the suffering of all of those peoples, which is real, right? And to be able to address all of those things, right? And to realize that, yes, political action needs to come out of that. Understanding needs to come out of that. Further engagement needs to come out of that. But the answer is not to avoid those truths because it will lead to problems in your congregation, but to try and address all of the truths because God is in all of those truths, right? And to shed light into all of those dark places is the thing that we need to do at this point. That carries us forward, not to avoid them, which I think is a tendency, especially in those kind of mainline, big umbrella churches. No, we need to talk about them, and we need to talk about this from all of those different angles: the economic, the racial, every single one of those anxieties and every single one of those groups that's suffering. We need to talk to every single one of those.
Also, that was the most Tolkien line of this season.
Yeah,
Power.
Yes, that was what I felt as well.
I was like, is this a direct quote from somewhere?
Yeah.
And I just anyway, I don't want to excursus on that. But anyway, yeah, Aaron, if you don't have a Tolkien related line,
you're really
don't worry. I've been Googling. So so I have a couple thoughts. I'm not sure they're all coherent, but I'll give them to the people who've asked, right? How do you do this in your churches? I am not a pastor and I am not a theologian. And so what I think is super relevant from philosophy is this idea: leaders are responsible for the compassion of those who follow them. So I really do think that part of what pastors must do is realize there is no way to speak to an audience, right? I give talks all over the country all the time. There is no way to speak to an audience and not risk losing someone in that audience, because you've always got to do your best to make sense of, right, well, who is this audience? What will land best? What are the right jokes to tell? What should I be wearing? Like, it's this whole performance, and part of understanding the other is recognizing I'll never have the other fully figured out. So I'm going to do the best I can. And I'm going to, if I lose someone, do my best to be responsive and receptive. And I think the best speakers are those who are also like musicians, like getting feedback from the crowd in real time and trying to kind of bring people back in. I need to drop a little 4 on the floor because the right side's not grooving with what I've got happening here. Oh, shoot. The left side, though, responds better when that snare's cracking on 2 and 4. Like being able to say, I can't be everything to everybody, no matter what Paul said, but we can try to leave the 99 to seek the one. It just might look like being responsive to the fact that risk remains. Right. And that humility about being a leader who understands we're going to do the best we can. And I'm going to try always to do even better if I feel like I've not done it well enough. But it's also important to realize you're going to lose someone. In fact, literally, as we went live, I got a call from my friend Greg Boyd, who, of course, lots of listeners know his work. And Greg famously wrote a book protesting the Christian nationalist rise and the militaristic descriptions and the idea that we are a Christian nation in this kind of classical sense. And he says, look, that's just false. And he lost an enormous number of his congregants. But he ended up getting more than that number coming because they were looking for someone who was willing to say what needed said in that moment. So I would hope that those wrestling with this would understand, as Maya Angelou puts it, quote, when you do nothing, you feel overwhelmed and powerless. But when you get involved, you feel the sense of hope and accomplishment that comes from knowing you are working to make things better. So I think if your congregants appropriately trust and respect you, they know you're trying to make things better. And then if there's disagreement, that hospitality is what I think pastors need to foster. I've been asked to leave, I think, 5 or 6 churches now at this point, and all of it has been because the pastors felt any question was a challenge to their authority rather than a mutual respect for thinking better about stuff that none of us have fully figured out, right? Well, that said, here are a couple passages that I think speak to me that I've been leaning on hard the last couple of days, and maybe it'll speak to others. Anne Lamott says, I have a lot of faith, but I'm also afraid a lot. And that's where I'm at right now, right? And then she ends this little passage by saying, faith includes noticing the mess, the emptiness, the discomfort, and letting it be there until some light returns. And for me, that's what this hour and a half has been, is us noticing the mess, trying to understand the discomfort, making sense of this, and then admitting we do not yet have this solved, right? But then I hear Bonhoeffer, who shows up and says, from prison, oh God, early in the morning I cry to you, help me to pray. Which I love that line, right? Not, I pray to you, it's, help me because I'm not even sure I've got the energy to do this. Help me to pray and gather my thoughts. I cannot do it alone. In me, it is dark. Like that's my throat punching, right? Like all I want, like that's where I'm at right now. But with you, there is light. I am lonely, but you do not desert me. And again, we talk about frustration and exhaustion. Dude is literally in jail saying I'm lonely. I mean, it's helpful to me to realize we're still hanging out and laughing with each other and enjoying beauty. And that's why I put the fall leaves behind me on my green screen, is to say, hey, even though things are collapsing in many, many horrifying ways, like my wife's Thanksgiving cactus bloomed today, right? There is still beauty. He ends by saying, my courage fails me, but with you there is help. I am restless, but with you there is peace. In me there is bitterness, but with you there is patience. So that I hope that is helpful to folks, because it is to me. Mm-hmm. If Bonhoeffer had bitterness and no patience and frustration and lost courage, hey, I'm in good company, because that's where I'm at. But then roaring up from within that frustration is, and so we've got the book, we've got the Amazon attempt, and so I'm going to quote the movie. A day may come when the courage of people fails, when we forsake our friends and break all bonds of fellowship, but it is not this day, right? And the fact that it is not this day is where I would hope pastors priests, imams, the rabbis, atheists, all of us get together and say, this is not the day where the bonds of humanity fail. And if it's not today, it's more likely that it also won't be tomorrow. And so I think if pastors will start leaning into that and then modeling the kenotic love of a God who says the human condition is not something to escape, but something to further be invested in, maybe we too can, with Bonhoeffer, with Anne Lamott, with Maya Angelou, and with Aragorn, what a cloud of witnesses, be able to stand in times that are deeply, deeply scary.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, I was tempted just to get out and read that whole passage from the book, Aaron. I believe there it uses the phrase "nevertheless," which is one of those Tolkien phrases, but I love it. Kevin may even know this. You know where he gets the "nevertheless"?
No.
Augustine.
Ah.
Like the in City of God, the nevertheless, like we're looking at reflecting on the downfall of Rome, like faith is the invitation to nevertheless, right? Like, what am I going to do with my next foot? Like, what does faith look like? Awesome. Nevertheless, be it walking into Mordor, the Battle of Pelennor Fields, facing a failed state and a failed church, and then you're alone, like Bonhoeffer. These kind that nevertheless is I think like what faith that has internalized doubt and self-criticism invites us to. And it's like, well, but I have one philosopher friend that talks about, faith is how you want to risk
with
your
direction,
own
or so I hear,
in a particular direction. So
that's right.
This has been fun. As much fun as this is, you know what I mean? I don't know if fun is the right word, but I really enjoyed it. And thank you all. In a couple hundred of you have even been joining live. That's awesome. And maybe we'll get to do this again soon. So, just philosopher and ethicist hanging out here.